Good morning and welcome. My name is John Hoyt. I am the Solutions Consultant at TMC. This is the August 2015 webinar for our TMC webinar series. Today's topic, we're going to look at what's new in Microsoft Dynamics GP 2015 R2. There'll be a little bit of a PowerPoint and then we'll go through some live demo. I always like to start off these with a review of the Dynamics GP roadmap. This is both indicative of where we have been, going back in this case to GP 2013, which got released about 3.5 years ago, through the subsequent releases of Service Pack 1 and 2, and then release 2 of GP 2013. The current version of the product, of course, is GP 2015. That got released the end of last year. And now the end of June this year, we've released the R2 version. Underneath each one of those release headers, you can see kind of the highlights or what the focus has been for each one of those different releases. And you can plug your own version in, kind of see where do I stand. In the previous history of Dynamics GP, going back historically, we typically were on roughly a 2-year release cycle. And in between those 2-year release cycles, there would be very, very little in the way of updates. Microsoft has changed that. We're now moved into a model where there's going to be some significant release roughly every 6 months going forward. So you can now see in the first of the light blue columns there, GP 2015 R2 just came out. They've already are talking about what's coming in R3. That will be out. They say H1, first half of 2016. My guess is that more likely will be sometime around late December. The updates are now inclusive of user-generated or user-suggested content, things that Microsoft is doing inside the product itself, integrations to larger parts of the Microsoft ecosystem, etc. This is going to continue. So the upgrade path, it's just something we're going to have to get used to. We're going to go through it fairly regularly. In terms of the overall architecture and the presentation of Dynamics GP, in old times, I might have shown you a slide that showed the Microsoft solution stack with Microsoft SQL Server and Microsoft Windows Server and all the other desktop and infrastructure kind of on-premise approach. Obviously, we're moving now more and more towards the cloud. We want to be something that is available through virtually any device that people want to bring to work with them. This applies primarily to our reporting tools, whether it's things like the Business Analyzer tool that I'll show you in a little bit, whether it is the apps that we are developing to allow for interaction with the GP system. And I've got an example of a time management app that I can show you. The development of these tools, whether it's for desktop, whether it's for any of the tablet devices, etc., we're trying to streamline. We don't want technology to be the barrier why people can't use or have access to what's going on in GP. At that work layer, in addition to the ERP package, we're bundling in interactions with CRM, with business intelligence, with something like Yammer for social media so employees can talk to one another and share documents back and forth. All this gets built on the modern versions of technology, what's called the service-based architecture. And of course, the underlying platform for all of it, we can now do all of Dynamics GP in Microsoft's Azure cloud. So if you don't want to have any footprint on your premises, you want to do everything in Microsoft's cloud, that's now an option with GP 2015 R2. Kind of the summary overview page. These are, I think, some of the real highlights of what's coming out in GP 2015 R2, and I'll show you some of these in greater detail as we go into the demo. To call out in particular a couple of them that I think are really kind of significant. Believe it or not, something as simple as the SmartList will now display the debit column before the credit column as a default for all the SmartList views, whether it's something that GP publishes or something that you create on your own using the SmartList designer. And to people that look at databases and systems from kind of an alphabetical point of view, credits before debits always made sense. To the accountants of the world that use these programs, no, the debit column comes first, please. So to me, this is something like a thorn being pulled out of my hand. doesn't really do much in and of itself, but it feels so good to finally have it done. We'll go through more of these in detail. There's a lot of neat things, and I think you'll really see GP 2015 R2's got some great benefits for you. In the realm of business intelligence, we talked about that debits before credits. This applies now in SmartList, in all of the Excel reports that would present trial balance kind of views, as well as in the parts of the database table structure and the view structure that you might be using if you're creating your own reports. So it's now the standard virtually throughout all of our reporting tools. Speaking of SmartList, in the past, whenever you created a new SmartList favorite, the preference default always went to system-wide. That's who's going to have visibility to it. And the impact of that over time, of course, is that the SmartList favorites folders start to fill up with lots and lots of views that you personally may not use. So feedback from the user community results in a change that says, can we now enable the system administrator to go in and specify what I want to be the default visibility? Now, as an end user, I could still change that manually on a SmartList favorite by SmartList favorite kind of basis, but the overall system default can now be set to go, we're not going to do anything except user. And a tool that was made available in SmartList Designer in GP 2015 was the ability to use the SmartList Designer to generate SQL scripts. And those SQL scripts could then be used in embedded Excel reports, for example, something of that nature.
Of the new GP upgrade. All right, what we finish up.
Well, that presented a bit of a security problem potentially for some people, because I have now generated a SQL script that I can embed, I can reuse, and it can be accessing my data without any really kind of knowledge or control. I don't know that someone's using Excel now to read directly out of the GP system. So we've leveraged our workflow, and we have now set it up so that if you choose, you can, before someone can generate that SQL script out of the SmartList Designer tool, they're going to have to submit it into a workflow. And that workflow will go through the normal workflow steps. Once the SQL script has been approved, then it can actually be generated and someone could use it embedded in a report, SQL reporting object, whatever it might be. The idea here being that someone has going to have knowledge of and approval that that script is being generated. It's now going to be available in the larger community. Just a nice little bit of security, I think, wrapped around that SmartList Designer tool. On the distribution modules, there has always been kind of a shortcoming in the GP world that says, if you didn't get a report generated on the day you needed it, you may be out of luck. And my experience with GP goes back to version 3, nearly 20 years. And there were times when you were doing things like year-end close where if you forgot to run a particular balance, you weren't going to get a chance to run that report again. And over time, those particular or peculiar little oversights have been eliminated for the most part. This is one more in that list. You can now run your historical received but not yet invoiced report as of any point in time. We've got the table structure updated to allow to pull from both the open and the historical, to walk through the corresponding transactions and adjustments, etc. Bottom line being, if you need for auditing purposes or something else to go back and say rerun that report as of this date and time, that's now going to be available. Going along with kind of the dashboard's perspective, the idea of presenting as much information in a single panel as we can, we've added a purchasing all-in-one document viewer. This means when I'm doing any inquiries related to vendors, to payables, to purchasing, if I want to see all of the related documents that belong to that vendor or that transaction series, I've now got one window that will show me a summary of each of those, dollar amount, document number, dates, columns laid out by the different document types. I have drill back functionality that's going to allow me to go back and see the details, etc. So if there's any questions as I'm mid-process, I'm doing a receiving transaction, for example, I can go straight back to the PO and see the details, or I'm doing the match invoice or whatever the step might be. The financial level, and again, this is a feedback from the MS Connect user community. We've added the ability now on a company-by-company setup basis to say, I'm going to automatically post my cash receipts as a full deposit in the bank rec module. In older versions of GP, that was always a two-step process. One step to do all my cash receipts for the day, and then a separate process to go in and say, okay, create my bank deposit based upon those cash receipts. Now I can link the two together. When I post my batch of cash receipts in the AR module, I can automatically post that deposit in the bank rec module if I set that up, choose to do it that way. Analytical accounting lists, for those of our clients that are using analytical accounting, there are now some updates to their transaction lists inside SmartList and inside the Excel reports. You can now list all of the different transaction dimensions as a unique column. In the past, those all got blended together into one column, and you pretty much had to go to Excel and do pivot tables to do dimension level analysis. Continuing to add to the workflows, and I'll come to some summary slides in a little bit to show you all the different workflows that have been added. In the past, when you were working inside the payables transactions, we had payables batch approvals. If you needed to do a workflow around payables, you were forced to batch the transactions, and then the entire batch would be approved or rejected, whatever changes might have been made. Some companies will do everything in a batch mode, and that initial model worked just fine. Others, however, either as an exception or as a regular process, like to process payables transactions individually, and there was no way to get an approval on a transaction that would be posted immediately outside of a batch. So we've now added in an approval level for transactions only inside the payables. A visual indicator has been added for customers that are over their credit limits. You can see that little yellow icon next to the customer ID field there. That little yellow icon, if you set it up, will be shown not only during the transaction entry, but transaction inquiry at the customer level for the card. Anywhere you would see the customer ID field, if they're over their credit limit, we're going to indicate that visually for people. And some of the traditional inquiry windows would have separate versions for open transactions and historic transactions. You couldn't see the entire history in one location, and we've now combined those windows together into a single view. I can still go through and filter by date ranges, by document types, etc., but I don't make an arbitrary distinction between what is open and what is historical. That's a database perspective in all honesty, and it doesn't really make much sense in an inquiry window. The same thing will be true with any go-tos or drill backs. If you're working inside SmartList or a drill back's been created from an Excel spreadsheet or something, when you drill back, you're going to go back to the combined history window, whether it's at the detail level or at the summary level. A little bit about HR and payroll for those that use those modules. In the reports that are output from HR payroll now, you will have an option to mask Social Security numbers. That masking will hide all 9 digits. This is at the reporting level. We have been doing that on the window level for a while, but the reports, when they printed out, we didn't have that mask on them. So when you render the reports now, it's going to come out as all X's for the Social Security numbers. The time management app. I'll show you this app in a little bit when I get into the live portion of the demo, but this is a great example of what we mean by a Dynamics GP companion app. This is an app that's designed to work primarily on tablets at this point. If you have a really large smartphone, I suppose it might be something you could try to do on a smartphone, but in all honesty, the real estate on phones are a little limited. But the idea is to extend GP's functionality, whether it's around purchasing and requisition, whether it's around employee self-service, whether it's about time entry for payroll or for project accounting or something. Let's make sure that we're putting a tool in the hands of the users that is going to be relatable to the hardware that they're carrying around. And so let's use Apple tablets or Android tablets or Surface tablets or something. Make them touchscreen enabled. So in this case, an employee would be able to log in, see their current vacation balance, see their sick time balance, what's available. Direct information pulled back from the HR payroll module. Transactions that have been saved and that are in process, or the creation of a new transaction, whatever it might be. This is also an opportunity with a set of development tools where we can start to create custom apps, and they can be published, essentially a private app store. So if you have a specific module or specific function that you want to enable through this type of tool, then we can develop that now. W-2s can now be printed by the employee as part of the employee's self-service user license. So in addition to the other capabilities that they've had for changing some of their demographic information, viewing or entering time off requests, in time management, et cetera, they can now print out year-end if they need their W-2. You're using GP's payroll module for that. And then at the system level, a couple things we've enabled. We've had a self-service user license for a while. We've now added a self-service user role with all of the appropriate self-service user tasks associated with it. So the process of setting up those employee self-service users is much simpler. On the security side, we can simply enable the appropriate role and user type, and they'll get access to just those parts of the system that their license would allow them to use. We've been able to email documents out of both sales order and purchase order for a while now, but the email template has been limited to typically just the blank form. And we know that for a variety of reasons, some of our client base will be using one or more of the other form types that are available for either sales order docs or purchasing docs. We now enable the email support for all of those different doc types, whichever one you have set up, whether it's at the system level, the customer class level, the individual customer level, et cetera. And document attachment for workflow. We have enabled inside the GP system itself, of course, quite a bit of functionality around document attachment and document scanning. We allow for the unlimited number of attachments and different record types, etc. We've also had workflow enabled for a variety of, say, requisitions or purchase order or something. We're now able to kind of meld those two functions together. If I create a requisition for the purchase of a new laptop, one of the things I want to include in that requisition now is the attachment. It is the quote or the spec sheet or whatever I might have to support my requisition. Those attachments will not only be saved as part of the GP record, they will now be included as an email attachment. So when it goes out for approval, not only will you see my request, but you'll have access to the attachments that I've included. Once it gets approved, routed back into the GP system for purchase order, it's all now permanent part of the GP system. A section that cannot go past, I need to talk about web, cloud, the Azure system in particular. As we went through that PowerPoint, you may have noticed that all of the screenshots came from the GP web client. This is definitely the future. And we now have two equal solutions that we can deploy on-premise on the right-hand column, all the traditional ways we've done it. Your hardware with your own operating system, SQL Server, etc., the infrastructure that supports that, and then the Dynamics GP system that goes with that. There is now from Microsoft, top to bottom, a complete Azure cloud solution if that's something you want to investigate. So they'll provide all of the infrastructure, all of the platform that you need. You still have access to all of the GP functionality delivered through the GP web client. It's the same experience. Really nothing being given up, just a means of changing that deployment model. With the web client itself, we've made a lot of efforts to improve its performance. It's now comparable or exceeding what's something you can do with, say, terminal services, and web client will scale much better as your company grows over time. A very important point right next to that, the way GP 2015 has been architected, the process of creating a new window is the same for creating a desktop version or a web client version, which means that anything that the ISV community is developing will work equally well in either environment, and there's no additional development cost for them to do it one way or the other. The only real difference is in what we call the presentation layer, but the same business logic and structure underlies both of them. This leads us to a world where you can do both. If you want to have some users' desktop internal for your own purposes, and you have other locations that need to come in remote and you want them to work web client, it's the same back end, the same infrastructure that will support it, whether it's on your location on premise or in the Azure cloud system. I won't go through all the details on the web client security. We're trying to make sure that there is literally no significant difference between on-premise, desktop, or Azure-based web client. It's encrypted, it's the same communication layers between the services, etc. The same security setup remains. And then last piece, and then we'll get into the demo itself. Oh, I'm sorry, two more pieces. The Business Analyzer app, I'll show you an example of that in a moment when we get into the demo, but again, this is some of the web-based reporting tools, refreshable on demand by the end user and available through their platform of choice. Surface tablets, iPads, Android tablets, whatever the executive or the field employee needs to carry or wants to carry, if they want access to the reporting tools, we'll make it available to them. And we're introducing a GP Office app for Office 365. This is going to allow us to take Microsoft Excel-based kind of dashboard information and view that as GP data and do it entirely through the Office 365 delivery. This is a free tool. It's simply a means of packaging. It shows the tightening of the integration, I think, between GP and Office 365. So if you want to give people access to those types of dashboards, financial sales, inventory, purchasing information, etc., in you go. And the time management app, we've talked a little bit about that. Okay, workflows, we have moved to the web client. That is now anything that could have been done desktop for workflow can now be done web client. Completely removed any dependencies upon SharePoint. The initial versions used a SharePoint logic engine in the background to actually route and deliver everything. Everything now done inside GP. More flexibility in terms of how you set it up, how it gets configured. In 2013 R2, we had our first 4 workflow types. In GP 2015, we added 9 more, and we have additional add-ons, as I discussed, things like that Payables Transaction approval or the SmartList query approval are now get added in as workflow setups. And like I said, I'm going to have all this available as PDFs that we can email out to you, so I won't go through these. They are kind of eye charts, but I'm trying to keep a running track of what's been released over the past couple of versions as it relates to things like the financial section, the distribution section. We talked about employee self-service. That is a user license that has its own set of functionality, and that's been enhanced. On the right-hand column were the initial releases of employee self-service and its capabilities, and then in the center column, GP 2015 R2, we've added in the additional workflows, navigations, the different timesheet entries, etc. We're moving to the employee self-service user because the business portal has now been officially retired. That is a legacy product. There is no more development or support being offered for that. All of the functionality that was available through the business portal itself has now been delivered through some other tools, whether it is the employee self-service user, whether it are the companion apps, the business analyzer tool, etc. That takes me to the end of the slide deck, so let me exit out of that. I want to pull up Dynamics GP, and I just want to go through a couple of pieces that we talked about in the slide deck, show you a little bit of that inside the GP 2015 R2 experience itself. The first one that I want to talk about, just inside that workflow maintenance. And when I first go into workflows, I have a variety of different workflow types that are available: financial, sales, purchasing, payroll, project, etc. Inside the purchasing, if I set up something like a basic AP workflow, I can then set up the approval that goes along with that. Now, there are a number of different steps I can create, whether it's a specific task, gather information, send more details, etc., or the final approval task, and I can layer those together in either a very simple or very complicated form. And I apologize, my desktop version doesn't have this enabled, but you can probably see down here grayed out, there's a send message capability. When you have your system connected to email, you can then send messages and all of the workflow information and updates get delivered via email. When that's enabled, there will also be a checkbox that allows you to go through and say send along the appropriate document attachment so that the reviewer, the approver, whoever's next in line will have access to the details that they're looking for and the supporting document that goes with that. I'll go down to vendor maintenance and pull up everybody's favorite Ace Travel vendor. When you're looking at any vendor now in the vendor maintenance or in vendor inquiry or a payables transaction or something, anywhere where I have the focus on a single vendor, I have now access to the all-in-one view. That all-in-one view will allow me to again see all of the relevant documents that are associated with that vendor, organized by columns, and I can specify how I want those columns to be sorted. From the Options tab, I can choose which of the different columns I want to have displayed. If their returns don't make any sense, for example, I can simply say hide returns. And of course, any of the blue hyperlinks will allow me to drill back and I can see the source document. Well, I can in practice, but I can't during the live demo. That same kind of capability, when I first come into an inquiry window, I don't have any record highlighted, so I'm not focused on anything in particular. Once I put the focus on a specific document, then the all-in-one view will become visible. Then I can drill back and I get to that same view again, all the details that are relevant for someone. I talked in the PowerPoint about the setup of the automatic depositing of your cash receipts. This is enabled at the company setup level, and if I'm running in a multi-company GP environment, I can make this decision on a company-by-company basis. Pull up the company that you want to adjust, go to the Options tab, and then scroll down through, and the final option now added in is that automatically post cash receipt deposits. And again, that will do that when I post a batch inside AR, it'll automatically update the bank rec module for me. Move into SmartList. Inside the SmartList, we talked about that display debits before credits. Again, the accountants cheer when we see things like this. Always been a small inconvenience. Nice to see things laid out the way that makes sense to the accounting people, not the database people. And again, that debit before credit will now be the default inside SmartList, inside navigation lists, inside the Excel reports. Anywhere where I'm presenting kind of a trial balance view, I'm going to present that automatically. If I go down to the admin section real quick, I want to pull up inside my setup section, come down to the bottom of the system. When I go to my system preferences, this is where I can now specify for the default SmartList visibility. I want this to now be done at the user level. That could be company, could be user class as well. That change will now affect every user the next time they log in and they go to the SmartList favorites, they want to create a new one, that's going to come up for them automatically. They can still change it, but that will be the default. Going back to that workflow maintenance for just a second. Did not point out while I was here. On the admin tab, this is the SmartList designer approval. I can now create a new workflow for this, give it a name. I'll allow my approver to delegate tasks in this case. I'm not going to allow the originator to be an approver. I will always require at least one. I can save that workflow, and then I would start to go through and add in the steps that I want to include. Who needs to be notified, under what circumstances. Essentially, I'm going to just give it a name and a description and then specify the condition. It's either always required, or if I specify that it's only required when the following condition is met, I can now say things like value greater than $100, or every time the user with this particular role creates something, whatever it might be. And then once that is enabled, before someone can use the SmartList designer function to create that SQL query, they're going to have to go through the approval process. Someone else will need to know and approve that that's something we're going to let them do. The sales transaction entry, talked about the customer function. If I put in a customer that is over their credit limit, I've always had the ability to get the little message. In addition to that message, or instead of that message, your choice, it's now an either or. I can also include that visual indication. That's going to show up here. It'll show up at the customer maintenance, the card level, at the inquiry level. Anywhere the customer ID field gets displayed and the customer is currently over their credit limit, you're going to make that information visible for people. Those are the kind of highlights inside the GP 2015 R2 product itself. The last two pieces that I can talk about real quick, I mentioned the time management app. Again, this is just an example of that, where an employee can view their current balances, see what they have recorded for time in, create new documents, etc. And finally, the Business Analyzer app, one of the other tools that has been used in replacement of the business portal, now gives a user through the desktop, through the web client, through their tablet of choice, whatever their platform might be, the ability to view current information presented to them in a graphical fashion, and then drill back reports. They can either change the presentation if they want to view it in a different format, change the date ranges, look at specific customer groups, etc. Lots of drill down capabilities. So with that, let me conclude the recording. Thank you very much for your attendance. This has been John Hoyt, Solutions Consultant at TMC.